I just wanted to ask you now about music and culture. You mentioned a record shop. Can you
Yeah.
say a little bit more about that as a kind of meeting space, as a kind of social meeting, social interaction? Where was it?
Yeah, the music shop was called Desmond's Hip City, also located on Shakespeare Road. Um, and a historian called Tanisha Ford has written a lot about Desmond's Hip City as a place in which people went to get their music fix, but also in a lot of ways to get a social and political fix. So I've seen some photographs of Neil Kenlocks in which Black Panthers are actually outside Desmond's Hip City distributing newspapers and recruiting people. So it was a place in which you could go to hear music, to get a sense of the latest fashion and the latest soul aesthetic, because it became a site for kind of the performance of soul and interest in soul music. But then you could also kind of go and understand what was going on in the political milieu at the same time. Uh, so it became an important place for people to gather and an important place for people to kind of have connections to what was going on culturally.
And also within the key Panthers, like people like Dorcas Howe, what was their relationship with the Notting Hill Carnival?
So for many members, Notting Hill Carnival was one of the highlights of the year. And it was a place in which people felt like they could, on the streets of London, completely be themselves and celebrate who they were, their culture, where they had come from. And I've seen many very celebratory images of people enjoying themselves at the carnival. Darkest Howe, I know, was very involved in the reorganization of the carnival, and in some ways in making it more political. And I know that Claudia Jones had been part of that initial vision for the carnival as well. So in some ways kind of carrying through some of her politics into a later date. Member Linton Kwesi Johnson has very fond memories of the Notting Hill Carnival, and there's a great photograph of him celebrating at the carnival. So it really is a place of pride for a lot of people, and I think it's really important to think about it in terms of spaces in London that people can politically express themselves freely. And the Notting Hill Carnival is one of those spaces, especially in light of continued attacks by the police on the Mangrove restaurant, which was another important gathering place for people in Notting Hill.
What was the role of the Mangrove restaurant? Why did it become so important?
So the manager of the Mangrove restaurant was a man named Frank Critchlow, who was really determined to allow his restaurant to be a gathering space for people in the community. So people would go there to eat, but they'd also go there just to kind of check out what was going on, see local people that they knew. In some ways, it's in our heads, it's difficult to understand what it would be like to have a local neighborhood restaurant in Notting Hill today, but it really was that space. It was kind of a Cheers of of London for people of color at that point in time. So you could go in and just hang out for hours. And the police, over a period of time in 1969 and 1970 especially, routinely tried to enter the Mangrove restaurant, and would enter and supposedly be looking for drugs. And the people of the community were really frustrated by the police's continued interference in what for them was an almost sacred space. And they decided to mount a campaign of resistance against this. And they gathered and marched on the 9th of August, 1970, holding numerous placards claiming that this was their space, that they wanted hands off the Mangrove restaurant. And there was an altercation between protesters and police. Althea Jones LeCointe, who was the leader of the British Black Panther movement, the only movement I know of to have had a female leader, got up and spoke to the people at this protest, really encouraging them to stand their ground. And the police attacked the protesters, ended up arresting 11 of them, 9 of whom were eventually tried in court. And this became the campaign around the Mangrove 9 trial became a national focal point. It's where the Black Panthers really became part of the national conversation, and the Black movement in general, as just a handful of the members of the Black Panther movement were part of the Mangrove 9, 3 in particular. So during this trial, every day, members of the Black Panther movement would go to the Old Bailey and would take turns transcribing everything that happened in the courtroom. Althea Jones LeCointe and Darcus Howe, two Panthers, decided to defend themselves in court, as opposed to using the court's appointed lawyer for them. Darcus Howe had studied law, and Althea Jones LeCointe was incredibly and is incredibly clever. She was a biochemistry PhD student, and they were able to successfully defend themselves, along with the court-appointed lawyer who represented the other defendants. For the first time in British history, a judge of the High Court acknowledged that there had been racism by the police. And this was considered a turning point for a lot of people. The fact that an agent of the government would identify this and would acknowledge it for people meant that finally maybe there was some public space to talk about this even more freely. So the Mangrove 9 were acquitted, and this was considered a massive victory for not only the Black Panther movement, but for the Black movement in general, and for the Mangrove restaurant.